How is everybody doing? Strength Chat episode 107, and today I have got a very special guest for you. Today I'm joined by a physical therapist based in Charlotte, North Carolina, providing a trusted resource through the Barbell Physio. Today I'm joined by Zach Long. How are you doing?
Doing great, man. Thanks for having me. Episode 107. That's a ton, man. Good work.
Thank you very much. I'm always surprised that that I've got this far. Sometimes I think it's only me that's listening to it, but I'm quite happy it's got to this point, and hopefully a few more episodes as well coming up. So how are you? What have you been up to? What's been happening in your world recently?
Oh, man. So I have just been basically working on both the website business and my physical clinic, trying to grow both of those as much as I can. So I basically have, two jobs that are 75% of a full-time job. So life's always fun. I don't get bored very much.
Enough to keep you out of trouble then.
Yeah. For sure.
So for obviously, when we got in contact via email, I mentioned that, I followed your work for quite a while. For everyone listening who, might not know your background or know the work that you do, just want to give a little bit of a background to yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a physical therapist and a board certified sports specialist. And prior to becoming a physical therapist, I was fortunate enough to work in a variety of different settings in the strength and conditioning world, and have been fortunate enough to then be able to kind of combine those two things together, where I have some of the knowledge of what it takes to make human beings stronger and fitter, and then we could take it down to the anatomy of the specific joints and muscles and kind of bridge those two worlds together, so that if you're having problems with certain movements, hopefully I have resources to allow you to figure out what you need to do to break through your health or fitness plateaus.
Nice. And what's sort of your background in training? Because I know you work with quite a variety of athletes and clients. What's your background in training and performance?
So started lifting, when I was probably 12 years old. I started lifting just for football, and then kept kind of training with that sort of like general sports training mindset until I was about 20 years old. Then I started focusing more on like bodybuilding type stuff for a little while, which bored the crap out of me. I didn't like working out, when you didn't have performance goals in mind. And since then, I've done a lot of CrossFit, took a little break to focus a little bit more on powerlifting, and now I'm kind of back into the CrossFit style training again.
Nice. So quite a broad spectrum of your own background in training, and obviously you mentioned there about the work that you do and the content that you put out there. And when you look at especially through your Barbell Physio Instagram and articles, you talk a lot about mobility, stability, and prehab side of things to reduce the risk of injury. Just want to touch on why is that so important? Because I know when you speak to clients and it's like, right, we're going to go through a little bit mobility at the start of a session. Sometimes people think, oh well, why do I have to do this? Can I not? Because I still see people coming into the gym now and just, right, I'm just going to jump on a squat rack, do a couple of squats, and then that's me warmed up, ready to go. Just want to touch on why mobility, stability, and the prehab side of things is so important.
Okay. Well, I'll first start by answering that by saying I actually think the most important part from a preventing injury standpoint is just to become fitter, period.
Yeah.
And not necessarily always being focused on mobility, stability stuff. That can be important. We'll get to that in a second. But I think the research has been pretty clear that people that are stronger, that have a higher chronic workload ratio, that are just generally more fit, tend to get injured less.
Yeah.
And so the biggest thing I think you could do from an injury prevention standpoint, get your squat and your deadlift and your overhead press stronger. Then, to be able to perform those movements with optimal form and technique, and kind of basically, I think, best spread the load out between multiple tissues, you need to have the ability of those joints and muscles to move to get you into as good a positioning as possible. So for instance, maybe one of the hardest movements that I work with, especially with CrossFitters and Olympic lifters, which tends to be my biggest population of clients that I work with, the overhead squat's a very important exercise for them to be able to perform with good technique. Now, the overhead squat takes your back squat or front squat up a level by moving the barbell even further away from your center of mass, so it's held all the way overhead. And quite frequently, you see little pieces of mobility be off with a movement such as that, that's going to put you in a position where you just cannot be as efficient in your transfer of force. So, for instance, we've all seen somebody with tight ankles perform a back squat. And if they have really stiff ankles and they can't drive their knees forward as they squat, it's going to force them to have a really forward torso position. So their chest is going to be kind of down towards their thighs more so than having a really upright chest. That's okay if we're back squatting.
Yeah.
But when we go to an overhead squat, that now puts our shoulders in a really sketchy position. So that is a case where we're just getting fitter in that exercise may not be the best way to go about reducing your injury risk or your mechanics. So that is a case where then addressing mobility becomes really important. From a stability standpoint, one thing that I see with a lot of individuals, especially when they're CrossFitting or Olympic lifting, where they're really dynamically moving into these in-range positions, is that a lot of times they just don't have strength and control in some of these awkward positions. So if we look at the training of a lot of Olympic lifters or CrossFitters, very rarely do they do a lot of tempo work where they're spending time down in the bottom of their squat and they're pausing for a second or two. Usually they're just performing really fast, rapid movements. And so teaching them to control those positions quite often leads to improvements in their performance overall as well.
You touched on there sort of mentioned at the start being, fit for the movement that they need to do. Do you think that's why, or a lack of fitness is why those clients or athletes may potentially get their joints beat up and have an injury? And in terms of actual fitness, what would be your definition of that to help improve those lifts?
Do I think a lack of fitness is what leads to a lot of injuries?
Yeah.
Is that what you said? I think most acute injuries happen either from, let's be honest, even if you're training perfectly, moving perfectly, good training volumes, things still happen where you tweak something just by a freak accident. But I think a lot of the overuse injuries that we see in athletes in the gym just come from doing too much too fast or doing too much for too long, where their body's just pushed a little bit beyond what it's currently capable of sustaining, and that leads to the breakdown of a tissue to a certain level. So if we think of somebody that goes into the gym and all of a sudden they double the amount of chest work they're doing over the course of a 2-week period, they really spike that volume up. Their body can't handle that large jump in what they're seeing from a training perspective, and that leads to them tweaking something. Or somebody makes a larger jump in their deadlift weight than their body was really ready for, and something gets tweaked because of that. That's probably the biggest reasons I see people get injured.
And with that, is there a difference between what you've seen between people who come in with, some niggles in their joints, or whether it's just like what you mentioned there, a tweaking a muscle or something like that? What's the difference between those sort of things?
So what's the difference between a muscle tweak and a joint tweak?
Yeah.
Really, I think it both still comes down to just that doing too much, too fast, too rapidly. Some of your approaches to those are going to be a little bit different in how I might treat that. But I think that the cause is usually going to be about the same thing there, where they just see these doing too much, too fast, too long, possibly with poor biomechanics. So the way I'm going to address that from a rehab perspective might alter a little bit. I typically find a lot of times when a joint is injured, it becomes, how do we go about continuing to exercise that joint without always further irritating that issue? So let's think of somebody that has an issue inside of the knee joint itself, inside of the tibiofemoral joint. I may alter their squat depth. I may change some of their movement patterns a little bit to allow them to continue to work out while we let that area calm down, versus somebody that's dealing with like a hamstring strain. I'm actually going to actively go after training that muscle through as much range of motion as I possibly can. So with the muscle strain or tendinopathy, I'm going to try to load that tissue up to rebuild its strength and its load bearing capacity back up to where they need it from a sports perspective, and then hopefully get it even more prepared for the demands that it's going to see than it was prior to injury.
Yeah. You said there about sort of the volume side of things, and obviously you said that you work with quite a lot of the CrossFit people that do quite a lot of CrossFit and CrossFit athletes.
Mm-hmm.
Those programs are sort of from sort of the outside looking in. A lot of people can mention that CrossFit workouts there is quite a lot of volume on there anyway. In terms of managing that between general population and CrossFitters, do you change how they work, how they'll do their programs? Would you say, right, you need to strip it down from doing, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 sessions a week, with CrossFit being known for having quite a lot of volume in their workouts?
So there's a couple layers to that question. The first I would say is if you actually were to go and look at like what CrossFit headquarters suggests from a volume perspective, CrossFit headquarters typical prescription of exercise is vastly different than what we see in a lot of gyms. So CrossFit headquarters would say, like if you go to CrossFit.com and look at their programming, it's actually typically very low volume. And instead they focus on pushing the intensity of exercise when somebody has the proper mechanics to have their intensity pushed. And so you typically won't go into CrossFit.com and see them program 5 sets of 5 deadlifts and then a long metabolic conditioning piece. CrossFit.com would typically program just the deadlift portion and say, we want you to deadlift and be so focused on your form and then building intensity that 5 sets of 5 deadlift is all you need from a stimulus from that day. Now, in the CrossFit world, so many individuals love that feeling of kind of having their soul crushed a little bit during the workout, that what we'll see is many CrossFit individuals put pressure on their gyms to continue to push the volume of training up and up and up, to where so many gyms now program far beyond what we see recommended in most CrossFit actual headquarters methodology. So that's the first layer to that, kind of, to me, is to distinguish between what you see in individual gyms and what you see suggested by CrossFit.com from a volume perspective. The second perspective there is, I guess, what do we do to manage that with certain individuals? I think everybody has an individualized level of volume at which they can currently tolerate. And that's based on so many different factors. That's based on, the stress level of your job, your home life, what your previous fitness level is like, and so many other little things like that. I do regularly have conversation with some individuals about figuring out how to come to a better balance with how much they're training. So if I'll give an example that I very frequently give of a client of mine who has a full-time job, 2 kids. She coaches like 4 classes a week at the CrossFit gym, and she regularly participates in CrossFit. She has an Olympic lifting coach and a gymnastics coach as well on the side. So she's training at really high volume. She's working at high volumes, and she has a lot of life stress. So that's an individual that I saw in the course of like 8 months. I saw for 3 different overuse injuries. And so that, to me, was her body screaming that something was off between her ability to recover from her workouts and the volume that was happening there, and the volume of just general stressors in her life. And so we did have to have some serious conversations about, this is, we're training for health and fitness. If you're continually getting overuse injuries, you're actually slowing down your health and fitness progressions. And so we had to have serious discussions on how do we manage the amount of training volume versus life stressors that you have, so that you're able to train at a more optimal level that allows you to progress your fitness without continuing to get hurt. So that's an individual where we started, tracking her daily recovery by looking at her heart rate variability. We started tracking her rating of perceived exertion and time that she spent in each exercise, so she could kind of see the trends in her training volume, trends in how her body was responding to that training. And then she had some objective data to tell her when she needed to back off of her training a little bit and when she could go a little bit harder. Those are not easy conversations to have with athletes, because especially in the populations that I work with, like going to CrossFit is the best part of so many people's day. It's where their friends are, it's their stress relief, etc. And so those conversations are tough to have, but sometimes they have to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, people can, especially, from like what you mentioned there about the CrossFit side of things, and why people go to the gym in general is that community feeling, like you mentioned, seeing the friends and that sort of stuff. But I think it's too easy for people to think, or there can be a culture sometimes of, well, I need to do more. I need to put as much work in as I can. And when you mentioned about what the CrossFit headquarters might recommend compared to what is actually delivered, do you think this sort of because having seeing sort of the movement prep and the warm ups that they'll do at the start of sessions, do you think they're sort of undoing that work by increasing the volume of the workouts and trying to push people a little bit too far? Does that all the warm up and movement that they do at the start just become a little bit redundant?
I think people, when it comes to their warm ups and the movement prep stuff they do, they need to become more intelligent. I certainly see, people waste too much time. You'll very frequently walk into a gym and see somebody do like 30 minutes of warm up stuff prior to working out. I don't think we need to do 30 minutes of warm up and movement prep. I think we just got to get more dialed into what you specifically need. And so then it becomes, does it impact their performance? Well, that depends on what they're doing. If they're, foam rolling for 20 minutes, no, that's probably not inhibiting their performance at all. It's definitely wasting a lot of time, and they're not getting a whole lot of benefit out of foam rolling for 20 minutes. If they're doing more aggressive mobility work, where they're doing, static stretching combined with lots of isometric contractions, and they're doing eccentric mobility work, things like that, if it's put at a high enough volume, it can certainly get in the way of their training a little bit.
So on that note as well, when you've mentioned about people training too much, and I've had it before with clients that have been coming into the gym, and they'll think that they're working on, and a little bit like what you touched on there, about coming in and if it does too much and starts hindering their performance. Do you think they are crossing that line between being unsure what recovery is and what sort of prehab exercise to stay on top of joint health? Do you think people get those crossed over, and push one a little bit too far and forget about recovery?
Yeah, I think they don't have the best definition of what recovery is from the start. And they think that foam rolling and mobility work is recovering. And there certainly are some small effects that you get from foam rolling or other soft tissue works that have a minimal effect on your recovery. But to me, recovery is really, are you sleeping enough? Are you eating proper foods to fuel your body to be ready for the next workout or to recover from this workout? And then are you monitoring life stress combined with training volume stressors to make sure you're able to train at optimal levels? And so misunderstanding the difference between recovery and movement prep work, or whatever you want to call it, is certainly a big issue. One thing I say quite a lot and get people a little fired up when I put this on my Instagram account is, you can't foam roll your way out of stupid training. If you're training like an idiot, if you're then not eating appropriately and you're sleeping 4 hours a night, like, no amount of foam rolling is going to make up for that.
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to what you mentioned about, that doing too much, it'll just end up hindering your performance. It's sort of just papering over the cracks sometimes.
Yeah.
On the flip side of that, obviously you mentioned if you're eating enough, if you're getting enough sleep and managing your stress, would you be able to increase the amount that you're pushing in workouts? Because I know sometimes people or coaches can say sometimes, right, well, you've only got to train 3 or 4 times a week. There's no reason to train or every day or anything like that. If you've got everything in order with your sleep and your recovery and your nutrition, is there any reason why you couldn't, increase your volume and increase the amount of days training?
Yeah. So the people that get injured the least in life tend to be those that are fittest. And so if we look at like research by a great researcher named Tim Gabbett, his research basically says that obtaining high chronic workload is the best practice for preventing injuries, or reducing injury risk would be a better way of putting that, not preventing injuries. I shouldn't have used that word. So we want to get people fitter. We want to increase the volume at which they're exercising at. The thing there is to make sure we take care of the recovery side, and that we're, consistently increasing that volume by putting more weight on the bar, by resting a little less, by adding in an extra session or a little bit more work within sessions. But it's about taking small, steady, incremental increases in that, not giantly, drastically jumping your volume up. Not saying, all right, for the last 2 weeks, I've eaten well and I've slept 8 hours a day, so I'm going to go from working out 3 days a week to 6 days a week. Let's throw in a fourth day a week. So let's go from 3 to 4, and let's hold that for a month. And if you're doing well, you still feel like you're recovered, let's bump that up a little bit more. Or maybe you've been doing 45 minutes of work 4 or 5 days a week, and you have a goal of improving your squat a little bit more. So we add in a little extra accessory work 2 days a week, 3 days a week, to help with that goal of building your squat up more. But it's not going in and throwing in, 2 more squat sessions. It's being smart about how we go about increasing that volume. But I definitely want people to consistently increase the amount of workload that they're doing. That is what we need to create fitter humans.
Yeah, just sort of two questions to follow up from that. Do you think that's where people sometimes go wrong? Because when you look at these CrossFit athletes, they can lift weight, they're fit as well, they're conditioned, and sometimes for the general population looking who might want to get involved in CrossFit, do you reckon that's why they rush too fast to be like, right, well, I'm going to try and do what they do and try and cram as many workouts in as they can, and just Google CrossFit workouts and try and do anything that they can. And the other question sort of is, how much of a lifespan does that have for increasing your training volume? Would be for a set amount of time, and then you would have maybe a deload or some time off, or could that be sort of infinite?
So I don't think it certainly happened in CrossFit a lot. It's definitely not unique to CrossFit in itself. Like I remember looking at bodybuilding magazines or going to bodybuilding forums back when I was, a little bit more focused in that area. And you would see tons of individuals saying, I just saw so-and-so's program in Flex magazine. I'm going to start doing that next week. Just like you see CrossFitters now saying, I know so-and-so does comp trains, CrossFit Games athlete level programming. And so they try to jump into that as well, because they believe to obtain higher fitness levels, they have to be doing what the elites are already doing. So that's certainly something that we see kind of across the board there. And can be problematic for people that aren't ready or prepared for that volume of training. That doesn't mean that everybody that jumps into that high volume training is going to automatically be injured. It just means that their risk of being injured, if they're not prepared for that, is going to go up. And I think at some point, if you're training at such high volumes that your body is not able to recover, you're going to see one of two things. You're going to see either an injury occur, or you're going to see a plateau in your progress, because a lot of people training at these crazy volumes are actually, it's all their body can do to just recover from those workouts at times. And so if they're not taking care of the recovery side, then, they beat themselves up. Their body recovers back to kind of their baseline, and then they get beat up again. They never give their body that time for positive adaptations. And I definitely think in the CrossFit population, one thing that needs to be utilized a little bit more frequently is the deloads that you mentioned there. We see deloads regularly used throughout the sports world, but very often CrossFitters kind of neglect that, and they tend to overlook the fact that so many of our positive adaptations to exercise actually happen during deloads or between workouts when we're resting. That's when the body has time to potentiate those that work we've done into actual physical fitness gains.
Yeah, I completely agree. I don't think it is just with CrossFit. I think it's, coming from a powerlifting background myself, I heard a story that Boris Shako had some programs released, and people started downloading these programs and started doing them. And it actually turned out that some of the programs. One was for sort of a junior 67 kilo or 66 kilo lifter that someone had started doing. The program wasn't for them, wasn't designed for them. It was designed for someone completely different, and yeah, they weren't used to the volume. They weren't prepared for it, so they ended up getting injured. It's like what I mentioned about. I remember Eddie Hall shared his program to deadlift 500 kilos. People started using it, forgetting that actually, Eddie Hall had X amount of years training to build up for it, and a completely different body shape and weight and all those sort of things.
And a lifestyle completely devoted to the goal of deadlifting that weight.
Yeah, absolutely.
I watched that documentary of his. I forget what it was called. It was a fantastic documentary, but just think of the how much his wife works, just to feed him to be prepared for that workload.
Yeah.
And most of us don't have that ability, where our wife's not running around just taking care of so many of our needs so that we can focus solely on training.
Just touching on that, and when you mentioned about having deloads or stepping away from training and doing something a little bit different, he actually put a video up, because obviously now that Eddie Hall isn't competing in strongman, he actually tried to have a day in when he was building up to deadlift the 500 kilos. He wanted to see whether he could do a normal day like that again, getting up, having food, and he really struggled, because obviously it's been maybe two years since he deadlifted 500 kilos. So it just goes to show how much, you can, if you step away from something, that you can't always just jump straight back in at where you're at. You've got to take that time and build back up to it, or, play around with what you're doing. Just on the, when you're saying about CrossFitters don't really, within that sport, aren't very good at taking deloads, or it isn't utilised as much. Why do you think that is? Do you think that comes from, like what you mentioned at the start, CrossFit gyms wanting to push it a little bit more, or are they trying to push the boundaries? What are your thoughts on that?
I think they just get addicted to the soul crushing workouts, that big kind of endorphin release you get after finishing something that hard and pushing your body to the limits. It feels good, and then you're there with all your friends that are also pushing themselves really hard that day. It's hard to step back, and it doesn't have to be a complete stop of training. It doesn't have to be that you don't go to the gym and hang out. Like, I'll very often include I call it just a cruise week for me. Like, I go in and I say, every day this week I'm going to move with the intention of having great mechanics on every exercise, every rep. I'm going to move with good speed. I'm going to get a sweat going, but I'm going to hit this workout at like 80% of the speed that I possibly could. And that's that's a deload week for me in the CrossFit space. It doesn't have to be that you go in and you kind of half-ass your training, and that you're, only lifting really light weights, or you're not training at all, or you're only going in 2 days. Just figure out other things to focus on. So if I was going in and the day's workout called for, 5 sets of 3 snatches, then what am I going to do? I'm just going to have my weight a little bit lower that day and really focus on, can I hit proper positions? Can I move this bar with maximal speed? And can I make sure I don't miss a single rep? And that's going to be my intention on that deload week, versus, on a week where it's a little heavier training, I may be trying to work up to, in those 5 sets of 3, the heaviest set of 3 I could do.
Do you think that sometimes comes down to the person's experience in being able to manage themselves, or do you think sometimes that is the responsibility of the coaches that they may have to say, right, let's work on some technical parts of the lift rather than pushing the weights? What are your thoughts on that?
I think a lot of that comes down to having a sound program in a gym, having a sound philosophy of what they're training for. They're training for most gyms, at least, they're not training to send people to CrossFit games or CrossFit competitions. They're training to make people just fitter individuals. And so I do think a lot of that comes down to the culture that you create in your gym as an owner or as coaches, and doing things like training different components of the lift, or training the lifts at different intensities, or having days or weeks where you alter the training enough to where it's not those soul crushing workouts, but you do explain to those individuals why you're doing these, long aerobic pieces that are a little bit more recovery in nature. But there's also a huge individual component there. I've gone to several gyms that have that philosophy in mind, but when those days or weeks show up where the intensity is down a little bit, as part of this gym providing just really, really good programming, there are going to be individuals that then still want to do more and go above and beyond that, and want to push the intensity piece and feel like they have to have that. And, I own a business. I own a couple businesses myself. I understand the need to keep the doors open and to pay the bills. And so then you have to, kind of figure out what your stance going to be there. I have a friend that owns a gym locally, and he changed his training up completely, despite the fact that he knew it was going to result, and it actually did result in him losing about 25% of his members.
Right.
But he decided that his belief on doing right by the other 75% outweighed losing 25% of his business revenue. Yeah. But I certainly won't hold somebody at fault if they, allow some individuals to continue to make some stupid decisions, as long as they still educate that person on, hey, I think we'd be better off if you do it this way. And if that individual decides to be a hardhead, then I think individuals have the right to make stupid decisions.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting topic to think about, because if you went to I actually had this conversation in the gym a couple of weeks ago, and it was a sort of we chatted, and I said, well, shall we not increase the weight? Shall we just keep it on that? No, I'm gonna increase it. Look, well, I've given you what my thoughts were. I said, would you go to a garage, and if the mechanic turned around and said, yeah, well, actually, we need this fixing, I probably wouldn't recommend a technique for a drive. Would you still go and do it? You probably wouldn't, because you'd take what that mechanic is saying. But there does seem to be, and I haven't found it in, I don't know whether you might have another example of anywhere else where someone who's not an expert but a professional within that field has given recommendations or advice for the best of that person, and it's just not being listened to, and then they might go off. They might not get injured. They might go off, still train, still push it, and not get injured. But there is always that chance that they might not listen and then go off and injure themselves. What do you think on that?
So I'll have a good example for you here. I had a client that I rehabbed after a shoulder labrum tear. So to get back to full CrossFit after a shoulder labrum tear that's surgically repaired, that's a very long rehab process. So it took about 6 months before he was back to doing all the movements that he would typically do in CrossFit. Another couple months before he was, moving similar weights and reps and moving at similar times to what he previously was. Well, about a year after this surgery, I ended up teaching an 8-week barbell club at his gym, where over the course of 8 weeks, we worked through a snatch progression to improve these members' form and weight lifted in the movement of the snatch. And I set all the weights up over the course of this 8-week session to where we were working different positions with a goal in mind of building this to a really solid foundation of a good snatch technique 8 weeks from now. But all of the weights were also programmed at levels that I expected that if somebody was following the weights prescribed here, they wouldn't miss a single weight, a single rep until at least week 6, if they were following the plan and staying true to the plan.
Yeah.
Well, this guy was in that class, and of course, like week 3 rolls in, he's working up to, I don't remember what the sets and reps were that night, but he gets through the prescribed weight and he says, I feel really good. I think I should keep going. And I said, your movement technique looks consistently better right now after just 3 weeks of this program. You're hitting better positions. You're moving the bar with good speed. We've accomplished the goal that we need to, especially for you after this surgery. I don't think you need to go up. I think if you go up, we're going to see your form break down. We're going to see you miss reps. And I want you moving the bar with speed and proper form and positions consistently until week 8 when we max out. Obviously, I want him to still do that in week 8, but but I don't want you to push the intensity. And of course, he didn't listen, which I was the coach of that class. And I said, you have the ability to make a dumb decision yourself if you want to. I literally said that to him. And he continued to go up. He did not get hurt, but he went up another 10 or 15 pounds and his form went to absolute crap. He missed the rep. He came back at the end of class and apologized. He kind of worked towards undoing some of the good work we've done over the course of 3 weeks by putting too much load on the bar and then neglecting his form and mechanics.
Yeah, it's one of those moments that when that does happen, it's sort of as a coach, you sort of sit back and think, well, I did tell you at the start, and the clients can come up a little bit sheepish, really, sometimes to say, yeah, actually, you were right in what you're saying. You touched on it a little bit and mentioned about sort of educating clients and athletes. Do you think for that example there of that guy that didn't listen, do you think it's down to a lack of education in what he's actually doing, or his experience of training, or do you generally just think it's down to, well, actually, I'm just going to be quite stubborn here and I'm just going to push it?
In his case, he was stubborn.
Right.
100% just being stubborn.
Yeah.
There's also the flip side to that where you'll have some athletes that and when Jimmy comes in and he says, hey, today's a really good day, the bar's been moving really easily, I think I should work up to a PR that day. And there are going to be some athletes that you need to listen to and trust and allow them to kind of coach themselves alongside of you. And so don't think that it's always, you have to stick 100% to the plan. Sometimes you can go past the plan.
Yeah.
But that's a very individual thing. Somebody like yourself or myself, we've been training for a long time. We have a lot of good awareness of what our training's like. If I walk in the gym and I just like the bar's flying around, everything feels great. Yeah, I might throw an extra 10 pounds on the bar that day versus a day where I'm not feeling as good. I might auto-regulate myself a little bit and drop the weight down a hair below what was scheduled for that day.
Yeah, a key point there that you said was auto-regulate. Not every day is going to be the best day, and I think we've touched on it a couple of times throughout this chat. Of it's not just about what happens in the gym; it's things that happen outside of the gym as well. Not every day is going to be the best day. Sometimes you need to rein it in a little bit. Sometimes you can push on and think, right, actually, I'm gonna see what I can do here. We've chatted about quite a lot of topics on there, and a common theme has sort of been preventing injury. Sort of the last question that I wanted to ask is, there is a lot of content out there on, right, we need to be doing this exercise and this will look after your shoulders or your hips or your knees or something like that. How much can you actually prevent injuries? Can you ever prevent injuries, or is it sometimes within someone's training lifespan, if you like, that there are going to be an expectation to have an injury? I know for me, competing in powerlifting, that I've had a dodgy shoulder. I've pulled my back. Whereas there's some people that have competed for or been involved in sport or competing for a similar length of time to me, but hadn't had an injury yet. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't believe there's any such thing as injury prevention. I think we can reduce the risk of injury at times.
Yeah.
But if you're consistently progressing your fitness and continually increasing the amount of workload that you're doing, I think at a certain point, everybody's going to tweak something.
Yeah.
Now, if you always walk into the gym and you do 3 sets of 5, squats at 100 pounds, bench at 95 pounds every single day or 3 times a week for the next 10 years, maybe because you're staying at that same weight and you're not progressing stuff, maybe you won't get injured, but you also won't realize the fitness gains and the potential health benefits that you could from pushing that workload up consistently.
Yeah.
So I think fitter individuals are those that are going to be less likely to get injured long-term and are going to be those that are healthiest and have the best life they could possibly have from a health perspective. So I think we need to be pushing that and understand that little tweaks and niggles are going to happen. And then we just adapt our training. We keep moving as much as we possibly can, and let the body take care of itself.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I know sometimes that people can think, you said there about coming in and using the same weight all the time. Yes, you may not get injured, but then equally you aren't really going to achieve anything if you're doing the same thing. There's that Einstein quote, isn't there? Trying to do the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is the definition of madness. I think sometimes when you need to push it and progress it, it's a little, I'll mention to people in the gym, look, we don't have to jump up by 10 kilos every week on your deadlift or your squat. Let's just go up a little bit at a time and gradually build it up. But if you do get these little tweaks or these little niggles, like what you've mentioned, and you've pushed it a little bit too far, it's a little bit like when I used to play rugby. You learn a lot more from a defeat than you do, just ticking along or winning. It's good to maybe learn from those mistakes that you've done before with the injuries or niggles. Quite a lot of topics covered there, and quite a lot of insights into your thoughts on training, which I really enjoyed. For everything that we've chatted about there, and for everyone listening, do you have any take-home points or words of wisdom?
I think the big thing would just be continually monitor how you're responding to exercise. Take a look at, what are your goals that you're working towards, and are you continually making progress towards those? If not, change stuff up.
Some good advice to finish on there. I don't think it's doing the same thing can sometimes get a little bit boring. Changing things up isn't always a bad thing. For everyone listening who might want to see the work that you do, or any questions on the topics that we've covered there, just want to let people know where people can find you or get involved in any coaching or training with you.
You can find me on social media, but I really try to direct people more towards my website, which is the barbellphysio.com. I think social media can be great and a great way to share some information, but you can't really get a whole lot out of a single social media post. So if you go to my website, there's a lot more articles and products that put a lot of little pieces together into bigger pieces to help you understand concepts or reach your goals a little bit better.
Yeah, 100%. Everyone listening, after following Zach's Instagram profile and then looking at the website, the articles that he posts are really helpful and has helped me develop as not just a lifter myself, but also as a coach, and how I work with my clients. So thanks a lot, Zach, for taking the time to chat with me. Really appreciate you jumping on the podcast. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.